Good evening. A warm welcome to those attending and also to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. This is a meeting of the Children, Families and Education Select Committee. My name is Councillor Heena Makwana and I'm the chair of this committee. Details of the business to be considered today is shown on the agenda, copies of which are available in the room and also accessible on YouTube underneath the broadcast. We are not expecting a fire drill, so if the fire alarm does go off, please follow officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting points. For those in the room, please switch any mobile devices to silent before the meeting starts. And when you are invited to speak, please ensure you turn your microphones on so that you can be heard in the recording. For those watching via YouTube, if you're so minded, you can complete one of our resident feedback forms. These can be found in the information section underneath the YouTube video. These forms are intended to help improve the way that we run our meetings. Okay, before we go through our agenda, I'd like to introduce colleagues in the room. So to my right, I have Councillors Haga, Batt and Cawthorne. To my left is our Democratic Services Officer, Ryan Dale. Then going along is Councillors Sweeting, Gill and Core, and Mr Tony Little, our co-opted member. Officers this evening who are joining us are Alex Coman, Susie Gladish, Chris Mayo, Andy Goodwin and Shalinda Patak. So welcome to you all, thank you. Right, going into the agenda, apologies for absence, Ryan.
Okay, we have apologies from Councillor Smallwood with Councillor Cawthorne substituting, and we also have apologies from Councillor Judge with Councillor Core substituting.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Councillor Cawthorne and Councillor Core for subbing this evening. Okay, agenda item 2, declarations of interest in matters coming before this meeting. Are there any? No, thank you very much. Item 3, minutes of the previous meeting, 27th of July. Agree? Agree, thank you very much. Oh, Councillor Sweeting.
Yes, I agree, but I'd like to thank officers for the additional information that we received on school places. I thought the map was very informative and the information on the Year 7 intake. So thank officers, please.
Thank you, Councillor Sweeting. Agenda item 4, to confirm that the items of business marked as part 1 will be considered in public and the items marked as part 2 will be considered in private. So there are no part 2 items, so we move straight on to item 5, which is our mid-year budget planning report. So over to you guys. Thank you. Andy.
Thank you, Chair. And so this is the first appearance at the Select Committees for the new budget cycle. We'll be updating the committee on the current challenges and the work underway to prepare the consultation budget, which will be presented at December Cabinet. We'll run through, we'll come back to this committee in January 24, where we'll discuss the position presented in the consultation budget and present the specific proposals within the remit of this committee for consideration. The feedback from this committee will then be included in the budget report, which will be presented to February Cabinet, where Cabinet will be asked to approve the budget proposals to full Council. Moving on to the report, I won't take you through the whole report this evening, but I'll just run you through the main headlines in terms of the Council's in-year monitoring position and to set out the context for the Council's approved budget strategy. So for 23-24, the Council are forecasting a net underspend of 23,000, with the services within the remit of this committee underspending by 174,000. This is being driven by a reduction in the support for looked after children from an improved mix of service delivery, alongside staffing underspends. Within these services, there are £1.4 million of savings to be delivered in 23-24. 774,000 of this is being recorded at Amber 2, with these savings relating to 229,000 for SEND transport management, 130,000 for the early years centres, and 415,000 related to fees and charges uplifts, with most of these being recorded at Amber 2 due to the difference between the financial year and the academic year, as we wait to see how these things progress in the new academic year. Furthermore, the school's budget is forecast to overspend by 4.5 million, with this being wholly driven by the high needs block, where funding has not kept pace with inflation and demand. Moving on to the medium-term financial forecast, in February 23, the Council's saving requirement up to the year 2027-28 was estimated to be 55.4 million, with the single largest factor driving this being exceptional inflation, with this element adding 60 million to the budget gap. Within the remit of this committee, the main inflation drivers are contracted spend for care provision and SEND transport, with these two areas accounting for 7.8 million of that £60 million requirement. Service pressures are forecast to be 23 million up to 27-28. This is predominantly driven by the impact of demographic growth within the borough, with 7.7 million of that related to services within the remit of this committee. So that breaks down as 3.7 million for demand for looked after children, 3.2 million for SEND transport, a further 0.6 million for asylum services, and 0.2 million for children with disabilities. So finally, in terms of the Council's wider budget strategy, corporate items are adding just under 12 million to the Council's saving requirement, with 6.5 million of this being related to the Council's capital programme, and a further 4.1 million being related to Transport for London concessionary fares, which is related to the recovery from the pandemic. Over the next few months, in the build-up to December Cabinet, we're going to continue to work assessing the budget gap, with inflation remaining stubbornly high and demand on council services being linked to cost of living crisis. Alongside this, we'll also be exploring ways to reduce the council's expenditure by driving efficiency gains whilst protecting frontline services, using the council's transformation process to formulate budget proposals that will be presented back to this committee in January. Thank you, Chair, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Andy. Any questions? Councillor Sweeting.
Particularly interested in page 12, the under new and emerging risks, and particularly obviously about our service area, our select committee area, I should say. Our major review is on the Stronger Families hub, and there are various comments from our witnesses on that there are more referrals and more need, basically. Has that at all been looked at or factored into the discussions that officers have been undertaking? I realise that the review is not complete and we are looking at it today, but certainly the pattern of expression on that review by quite a few of the witnesses is because of the, additional popularity. That's a wrong word really, but it's a tight ship, let's put it that way. So has this been considered by officers looking at our budget?
Thank you, Councillor Sweeting. So as part of the analysis of the budget gap, we look at the three main drivers. So that's inflation, demand-led growth, and corporate items. So within the demand-led growth, we look at the impacts of demographics on the council services, which includes not just population projections, but also demand for services. So we take into account the wider kind of ONS projections on what's happening within the borough for our population. Then we look at our local knowledge through the front door and through performance management information. And then we also work with the service areas. So we're not just looking backwards and how that might look forward, we're also talking to sort of service leads to work out how they think the services are going to progress. We then, throughout the autumn, run MTFS strategy workshops with corporate directors and heads of service, and then we use those workshops to bring that all into one place to work out what we think the service area needs as a budget, and that will then go into the MTFF once it's signed off and approved by the director for as a budget proposal in that medium-term financial forecast. Thank you.
A follow-up. It's concerning vacancies. I mean, obviously, if a post is not required, then it's not required. But what is the capacity of the vacancy capacity, if you like, and how much is that in our select committee area? And are those posts likely to go if they are vacant at the moment?
Thank you, Councillor Sweeting. So at the moment, the council sets a managed vacancy factor within its budgeted establishment. So we know that we're never going to spend the full staffing establishment because there's always going to be an element of churn. However, what the council's approach is that we look at where services can have a level of churn and vacancy, and therefore we attach that managed vacancy factor to those areas. where there can't be a churn, so for example, frontline services where there's either CQC in adults or other governing bodies that set the relationship between ratios between carers and cared for, then in those areas we don't have such a target. We then monitor throughout the year. So in 22-23, the managed vacancy factor was about 4 million, and the council's underspend against staffing was 8 million, so we did overachieve that target through churn. So this year, we're currently not seeing that across the council as a whole. However, at this point of the year, because it being an early point in the year, it's hard to say what churn is going to happen in the future. So it's something that we monitor on a regular basis on our monthly processes and report back to Cabinet. So it's something that will be kept under review throughout the year, but it's not until those autumn MTFS strategy workshops that we'll start to look at proposals. But we wouldn't look to take out posts where we think there is a need for that post. Thank you.
Ms Little.
I'd like to ask about the Send Transport. Is the cost pressures in this area due to contractors charging more over and above what petrol costs and such like are, or is it purely the underlying fuel? And are there any volume drivers in terms of the take-up that are driving it?
Thank you. So within the council's budget strategy, we have the demand-led growth element of what makes up the saving requirement, and we also have the savings which then are used to bridge the gap on that saving requirement. So Send Transport is an interesting area where it gets reported in both areas. So the way we approach this is that within the demand-led growth, we forecast based on kind of 2B, where we would think we're going to head to with that demand. And then we then look at how we could manage that going forward. So we then have a saving in for the where we think we can make reductions. So within the council's capital programme, we also have an increase in the number of SEND provision that we're looking to increase within the borough. So the element of transport related to increasing the provision in borough then helps to bring that transport cost down. So that it's not quite as straightforward as being able to say, yes, it's demand, yes, it's fuel, because once we've got all that information, we then need to look at the demand, we need to look at route mapping and make sure that we're maximising the efficiency of those routes. So it's about the whole picture. That might not answer your question exactly, but it's very hard to break it down into constituent elements. But you're right, that fuel inflation has run high in the past, although fuel inflation is starting to come down. But we did have quite a generous fuel inflation uplift in the budget for 23-24. Thank you.
The impression I've gained from the high needs spending is this is an area where volumes are still increasing, and that therefore it must be harder to achieve the savings on the transport side of it, that the increased capacity is doing no more than restraining the growth rather than preventing the growth.
Thank you. So that's actually one of the reasons why that Send Transport saving is at Amber 2 at the moment. But it's quite hard to say until the academic year starts that we know where the demand's coming from. So clearly we're not going into this completely blind at this point of the year, and we are looking at historic trends. We're looking at working with the service area and our service colleagues to understand where we think the demand's going to come from. But once we start that academic year, we get a lot more clarity on that. So you'll see those updates coming through in the monitoring process and the monitoring to the budget monitoring to Cabinet. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cawthorne.
So it is. There you go. I need more practice, don't I? A couple of questions. The first is in relation to the strategy to deal with the budget gap. Make sure I understood what I think I heard you say a moment or two ago. I'm interested in how developed our thinking is around how we're going to go about doing this. So whether it's sort of high level or conceptual at the moment, or whether we've got a sense of what that might look like for individual service users. And if we don't know that now, when will we have a little bit more meat on the bone to understand what that's likely to mean. So I suppose that's my first question. Shall I ask my second one now, or? Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Cawthorne. So the budget strategy that was presented in February 23 had a £10 million saving requirement for 24-25, and it had a saving programme of equal value. So we went to Cabinet and Council with a balanced budget for 24-25. Within that saving, the saving programme, there was an element which related to ongoing fees and charges uplift, so that's related to predominantly just lifting those in line with inflation projections. And then it also had a year 2 impact of, full year effect impact of parking increases. And then in the future years, you then see the budget gap start to open up. So 24-25 had a largely balanced budget. There were some further bid savings still to be identified through the bid process, but most of the savings had to address that gap had been identified at that point. So clearly, as I've mentioned in the report, we're still doing horizon scanning. So the work that we'll be doing in the autumn will then reassess that budget gap in terms of the latest intelligence for demand, inflation, etc. And those workshops will then look at how we can shape the Council's saving programme going forward, looking to maximise transformation opportunities, increase efficiency and protect frontline services. So the proposals will be presented to Cabinet in December and then brought back to the committees in January for discussion. Thank you.
I had another question, and that's on point 26, and I'm just interested in what it says there about there's a reference to the legacy elements of pandemic-driven demand for services. I wonder if you can just say a bit more about that, what that actually involves, please. Thank you.
So we've seen increased demand during the pandemic for social care, both across adults and children's. We've seen particularly high demand for services relating to mental health of our residents. So what we saw during the pandemic was an increase in demand, and then we're starting to work across the service areas to see where we can help to support residents better and manage some of that demand. So we're still seeing high numbers within the mental health service. So within older people, so within adults, there is a mental health reablement saving where we're looking to work with those people and hopefully deliver an outcome that helps to support the resident and also reduce costs. Within children's social care, we have seen that we did see an increase in demand, and we are starting to see that level of demand level off now. We have got an underspend in looked after children in 23-24 at the moment, but that isn't really related to reduction in the number of children that we're supporting. It's actually by having a better mix of the service provision for those children. So during the pandemic, we saw issues with courts, which made it harder to move children onto more suitable placements. So as those courts open up, clearly there was a backlog. So as time goes on, that backlog reduces, which enables us to bring the demand levels down. I think most of the demand within the children's area has now pretty much levelled off from COVID. We're still also seeing additional demand ongoing from within homelessness and that area, but that's also being linked into cost of living. So it's actually quite hard to separate COVID from cost of living, but we are seeing additional pressures within our homelessness budget, which much of that is supported by government funding. Thank you.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Chair. I note that on page 7 and page 10, you've reported some underspending, and I'm not sure if I've kind of understood this correctly, but I note there's an underspend of £174,000. I assume it's quite unusual to have an underspend in sort of children's services. I'm just wondering why there is an underspend and how we propose to reallocate those resources.
Thank you, Councillor. So as you say, it is unusual for children's social care and services to underspend, so well done to my colleagues to my right. So what we've seen is, as I've said, we haven't seen a reduction in the number of looked after children. We're seeing them going off to the correct service levels, and some of that has been linked to that pandemic issue with the courts. So we're seeing there's less numbers in residential at the moment. and the supported living unit costs have also come down. So we've been, it's probably, I don't know if Alex can give a better update on it, but I think where we've worked with commissioning, we've been able to drive unit cost efficiency. So it's not that we're supporting those children, it's just that we're doing it in the right setting and at a better price. Thank you, Councillor.
Okay, Councillor Gill.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of questions from me. On page 13, the DFE approved the disapplication to allow Hillingdon to take money from the school's budget, just to help reduce the high needs budget. I mean, just looking at that, it might not be a good look, just thinking about other schools that are struggling financially. I'm just wondering why the council opted for this course of action.
Thank you, Councillor. So the current position on our high needs block is that the council, the DSG, has been underfunded. So that's going back to probably 2015-16, which is why we've got the accumulated deficit. And that underfunding requires an additional contribution from schools. So it was proposed to transfer 0.5% of the schools block to the high needs block to contribute to the additional cost of high needs placements. Schools Forum did not agree to that request, so the council put in a disapplication request, which the DFE agreed, so that was transferred to the high needs block. The primary drivers for the increase in costs in the high needs block is on the independent placements, and it's on the number of out-of-borough independent placements which we've got. So we have in excess of 200 out-of-borough independent placements now, which are the most material costs in the high needs block. And within the safety valve agreement, there's a range of proposals to reduce that spend and increase provision in borough.
Second question, totally different. So it's also to do with the some councils have been required by the DFE to cut EHCP plan funding by 20%. I was just wondering if Hillingdon was one of the councils that the DFE asked to do that.
I don't think we have a specific number in terms of reducing the funding on EHCPs. So we have a programme of works to reduce the spend in the high needs block, and there are a number of different schemes, including reviewing the banding model, ceasing, stepping down, alternative provision, and we're working within the safety valve agreement and with the DFE on those specific schemes. So I'm not aware of a specific number that we're working towards, but there's a range of proposals. I don't know if Alex, if you've got... No. Okay.
Right, thank you. Councillor Hager.
Thank you. Really good in-depth report, and having not had really much with numbers, I've had to really look at it, but it's a really good report. You've got to really get into it. My question actually is on page 11, and we've already covered a little bit of the SEND transport and about how we're looking at it's going to increase. You've got forecast increase of the cost of care provision and SEND transport. It's probably a bit of a difficult question to answer, but do you believe we're economically at our peak at the moment, or do you believe that this could last for longer? And the provisions we've got set in it, I think we've done really well actually on the cost savings, and having money actually already in there is really wise. So we're emptying that, aren't we? And provisionally, from what I can see, is already in the deficit that we're going to carry forward. Those cost savings are going against that. But where do we see that might stop? Are we at the peak now? I mean, it is a difficult question. Or have we seen economically that we might look at coming into, the opposite way round? So actually where we're going to find a reduction rather than an increase. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So in terms of the economic forecast, so the government do publish their forecast as part of the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility. Within there, they do publish inflation forecasts, not just their own, but across the number of institutions. So across those forecasts, including London organisations, outer London, the forecast on inflation is 7% for 2023 as an average, falling to 3% for 2024, and then 2% thereafter, with 2% being the Bank of England target rate. But when you look at those projections, the upper and lower for those is quite stark. So to say that we're at the peak of our economic situation, I wouldn't like to put my pension on it. But the way the council approaches the budget strategy is that we do go with a low-risk strategy. So where we're quoting figures like 60 million going into the inflation requirement, that's we go low risk so that we can ensure that we've got enough money there. And then should those lower projections materialise, then clearly we're going to get a benefit from it. But should they stay stubbornly high, then we've got the projection within the strategy. And we've also got a further inflation earmarked reserve on the council's balance sheet should economic circumstances be even worse than our low-risk strategy. It's quite hard to say where demand is in terms of the economy, but obviously that can vary as well, and that's linked to a lot of things such as like the schools building programme and increasing the provision within the borough. Thank you.
Councillor Kaur.
Thank you, Chair. Just following up on what other colleagues have said, I just wanted to understand the contracted spend for SEN and SEN transport. Is it a third-party thing? Do we outsource it to other contractors? That's why it's a contractor spend. And have you given it a thought that or do you have an opinion on if it was in-house, long-term, would it be better in terms of saving and consistency of services that we provide to our own residents than giving it to third party, and we might be able to look at some costs there. And thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So the service is outsourced at the moment, and there's always going to be a discussion of in-house versus external, and it also can vary on many factors such as demand, but it can also be economic circumstances. We're seeing at the moment that with inflation remaining high, the pay award is coming out above the budgeted position, so that puts pressure on in-house services. The thing I'd say about SEN transport is something I mentioned earlier around we can't just look at demand and price, we need to look at holistically around route planning. So you want to have the right number of buses, the right number of transport assistants, etc., within that kind of programme. So what you don't want to do is go out and buy all those buses, and then you increase the provision in the borough, and you're on a 7-year life cycle, say, of a bus, and then suddenly you've got to let go of a bus. You may make a loss on that. You then may have more efficient route planning, which then means you can take a bus out, or you may need to bring a bus in. So there's maybe a certain element which could be in-house and a top of an external, but then you might be looking at reduced economies on scale on that element which is contracted. So I think at the moment the way it's working is I think it is the most efficient way that it can work. But it's something that we will always review. So in the monthly monitoring process, we look at where we're seeing pressures. If we see pressures coming through, then we look to where we can mitigate those. So we would always look that if we think an in-house solution would work, then that's something we'd definitely explore. We also have the MTFS strategy sessions, which run twice a year, where we would be looking at what we're seeing in the monitoring, what we're seeing in the markets, and kind of bring procurement, finance, and service experts all into the one kind of environment to look to see where we can maximise efficiencies. Thank you, Councillor.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And you mentioned 200 plus independent placements outside the borough, which are also costing us a lot of money. Assuming that these are secondary places, and assuming that we don't intend to build a new secondary school, you said we have to find solutions to that. What solutions do you have in mind for that? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. As part of the safety valve agreement, there is additional capital funding, so the DfE are providing capital funding to increase the provision for special resource provision in our secondary schools. So that is ongoing. So that's the main area at the moment. We're also reviewing the need and the requirement of all of our the HCPs.
It's reassuring to know that it's continuously looked at and reviewed. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Councillor Sweeting?
I think the hot press from Kent is that they've got quite a lot of additional funding for their unaccompanied asylum seeker youngsters. I mean, they're a port authority, but Hillingdon's a port authority. Is any crumbs coming our way by any chance?
Thank you, Councillor. Well, I will be looking out for any crumbs, so don't worry, we're definitely always on the lookout for further funding. So I think that the issue that we're seeing within the asylum service is just that the funding from the Home Office hasn't been inflated in line with the inflation in the economy. So all the services provided to the asylum seekers should be funded through the Home Office, and we do end up incurring some costs within the council itself as a result of things like I think it's age assessments land on us. So this is why we've got a 600k pressure within the budget. Some of the asylum seekers may not qualify for funding as well, but yeah, the biggest driver at the moment is the inflation ask, but that's across pretty much all government funding. So they're not looking to I haven't heard that they're going to reopen the settlement at the moment, so we're not seeing any additional funding for inflation pressures across the whole of the council's government funding.
It just intrigued me why Kent has managed to secure 10 million and we've been left without any extra money.
Okay. Do we have any other questions or comments? No. Okay, great. We can bring this item to a close. Thank you all for joining us. You're free to leave as you wish. Next agenda item is Children's Safeguarding Partnership Annual Report. I believe, Susie, you'll be reporting on this. Thank you so much.
So the report that has been provided sets out the work of the Safeguarding Adult Board and the Safeguarding Children's Partnership in the year 2022 to 2023. It provides you with an overview of how the partnership has strived to continuously improve safeguarding practice. Sorry, is that better? Thank you. And how we have worked together across the multi-agency network to essentially work to keep children and adults safe. In the summary that I will give you today, I'm going to focus more on children, because obviously we're in the Children's Select Committee. So just starting at the very beginning, I think it's helpful to set out the vision of the partnership, and that is that every child and young person is safe, that they feel safe, that they enjoy good physical, emotional and mental health, that they can take pride in their unique identities, and that they can feel that they belong and have opportunities to thrive. So essentially that's what we're setting out to do as a partnership. For people who may not be aware, the Safeguarding Partnership is made up of the three statutory partners, the police, the local authority and the Integrated Care Board. They have shared an equal responsibility for safeguarding within the borough. And make up the executive leadership group. So our Children's Partnership and our Safeguarding Adult Board report to the same executive leadership group. One of the things that the ELG has to do on an annual basis is to commission something called independent scrutiny. So that's essentially an external expert who comes along and provides us with an independent view around the work that we're doing. We had in our first year Alan Caton, his name is. Alan came and looked at the structure of our arrangements, so were they solid? And in 22 to 23, he came back and explored the impact of our arrangements on safeguarding practice for children and families and with adults. For children, Alan looked at our work in relation to contextual safeguarding, so that's thinking about the risks that young people can face in the community. What he found was no areas of poor practice in service provision for adolescents at risk of harm. He identified strong leadership from our exec group and a clear sense of joint and equal responsibility. He commented on the maturity of our safeguarding arrangements and that we are able, as a partnership, to facilitate healthy challenge and that allows us to improve practice. So one of the things that we really focused on last year was ensuring that we effectively seek the voice of the child and the voice of the adult. So you will have seen within your report that we've got our very first children's annual report. That was the culmination of a several-month-long piece of work that included a co-produced piece of quality assurance work that sought really to understand the experience of children and adults who receive a safeguarding service in Hillingdon. So going to the children's report, our children are very clear that they were feeding back based on their own experience, on the experience of their friends, of their siblings and of their peers. We asked them a few key questions, so how do you feel? Do you feel listened to? What's going well? What can we do to make things better? What worries you or makes you feel unsafe? And actually, what can we do to change it? Our children reported that they can really tell when professionals are going above and beyond, so we can tell when they really care, and they can tell that there are a number of professionals in Hillingdon across the partnership, so not specific to children's services, who genuinely care about their well-being. What was interesting is that they also commented on the impact of our awareness-raising work. So one of the things that we do throughout the year is promote various safeguarding events. So, for example, Child Exploitation Awareness Day, we might do some work promoting Pride, mental health awareness. Coming up, we're looking at anti-racist practice. So there's all sorts of different things that happen through the year. And what was significant from our consultation with the children and in their annual report is that they notice, they're aware of what we're doing and it is reaching them. So I think that's an important message from the annual report. Their worries are around safety in the community. They notice racism, they notice poverty, they're concerned about school exclusions, they're concerned about whether they're learning the life skills that they might need as adults within the school, and they worry about money sometimes. We ask them, what do you think might make things better? And they've identified that all childcare professionals should have mandatory training to understand what it is like to be a young person. So I think several people here have probably been to the Walking in Our Shoes training, so that's what they were referring to there. They talked about meaningful engagement, so actually acting on what was said, not being tokenistic. They talked about the power of relationships and how to build trust. And they talked about the importance of early intervention, and these are all things that I think we're aware of as adults involved in safeguarding as well. They'd like to see more focus on life skills in schools. They'd like to see improved youth provision in the borough, so more kind of positive pro-social activities. They'd like to see peer mentors, so they want to play an active part in safeguarding and in looking after one another as well, which is interesting. They'd like to see us communicate using their methods rather than ours, so thinking about social media and those sorts of things. Not my area, but we'll give it a go. And they wanted to meet with our senior leaders and decision makers to speak to people directly and to find out what it is they actually do, which was really important to them. So lots of that has happened. Moving on to the kind of the wider report. So each board has a variety of priority areas, so areas of focus work. Work on each of those priorities is progressed within a multi-agency subgroup using a very simple framework of prevention, identification and response. So we're thinking about how do we prevent child sexual abuse, how do we identify it, how do we respond to it, and then that applies across whatever the topic of the subgroup is. In the financial year, we have progressed work within our contextual safeguarding subgroup, the strategic high-risk panel. One of the things that happened within that subgroup was the development and launch of the contextual safeguarding strategy and also our education inclusion toolkit. So that is designed to support education professionals to recognise where a child's behaviour might be indicative of an unmet need and to then be able to access support for that need. So we're seeking to reduce the risk of school exclusion, which then reduces the risk of a child experiencing extrafamilial harm. Within our child sexual abuse subgroup, we've developed a really successful informal partnership with the National Centre for Expertise in child sexual abuse. That has enabled us to provide local partners, local practitioners with piloted training, so training developed by experts that we are then able to access for our local practitioners and contribute to the final version of before it's rolled out nationally, which has been really successful. We have concluded some areas of work, so our domestic abuse subgroup has concluded as a formal subgroup. That doesn't mean that we are no longer progressing work in respect of domestic abuse, it just means that we don't have a dedicated subgroup for that. I've mentioned awareness-raising activities, so I won't go over that again. We have implemented a learning from practice frameworks in children's and in adults. They mirror one another. And although we're talking about children, I think the mirroring is important to understand because it reinforces our approach to think family. So we want our adult practitioners to be thinking about child welfare, and we want our child-focused practitioners to be thinking about adults with care and support needs. So we try where we can to mirror across both. Across the year, we have undertaken 3 learning reviews. The Serious Youth Violence Learning Review culminated in 2 very well-attended safeguarding learning events and the launch of the contextual safeguarding strategy. We have also implemented a very wide-ranging multi-agency quality assurance framework. So that's where, as partners, we sit down together and we'll look at an area, and depending on the nature of the task, we might adopt like a qualitative review. We might be looking at kind of quantitative data. We might do something that's a combination of the both, or we might co-produce something with our children and young people. So in that year, we undertook the Section 11 safeguarding audit. So that provides assurance around safeguarding arrangements within partner agencies. We had really good take-up across the partnership this year, particularly from our GP practices, which I think is a credit to the ICB and the work that they did engaging with GPs. Areas of recommendation that came from that included raising awareness of the importance of and the role of the LADO, so the local authority designated officer, and the voice of the child. Similarly, we had some findings in our education safeguarding audit, so that's the Section 175-157 audit. It was hard for our schools to complete that. We had quite a lot of discrepancy in the response, and we think that was probably down to the tool not being quite as good as it could have been, to be frank. So we're looking at that again this year and working directly with schools to develop something that's a bit more useful. We've also undertaken audits in respect of stronger families, so looking at the MASH, looking at quality of decision making and consistency. We found clear analysis across the MASH assessments that we looked at, and an area for development was noted around ensuring the involvement of dads and of fathers and of male caregivers within the family. Within our strategy discussion review, we highlighted consistent decision making and kind of defensible decision making. It was clear why a particular decision was made, but there was some variation in recording practices. So we try to, as a partnership, whilst we are also we're seeking to identify areas of learning, and we also want to build on what is going well, and so to operate from a strengths perspective as well as identifying opportunities for development. So we've done all the audits, looked at learning from practice. All of that feeds into our training programme. You'll have seen that we had very successful year in terms of training this year. We had a 43% increase in the number of sessions of continuous professional development we were able to offer. All of our approach to training basically takes a scaffolded approach. So we will develop practice briefings that provide really a very high-level snapshot of this is what you need to know about a given topic. We might raise awareness through our newsletter. We might develop a webinar, we might deliver a learning event, or we might commission half-day or full-day training. By and large, feedback on training is very good. Attendees report that it is useful and it is helpful for them in their practice. So that's training. So it's quite a big report, so I'm trying to just give you the highlights, but there's a lot. And then in terms of highlights from partners, I think we've already heard about the local authority experiencing a sustained increase in need post-pandemic, likely due to the cost of living crisis. That's been seen across all services. Our Children and Young People Services have welcomed into the fold education and SEND. Within our integrated care partnership, there's been lots of work undertaken rolling out and driving the use of annual health checks for people with learning disabilities, starting at the age of 14. That's really important from a health promotion point of view. Within our Central and North West London NHS Foundation Trust, they have celebrated the Year of the Child in the last year. So have done all sorts of wonderful things, highlighting the importance of the voice of the child to safeguarding practice. Hillingdon Hospital have been working with a focus on how we support 16 and 17-year-olds who may be having their clinical needs met within an adult ward, how we support the staff that are involved with their care to understand that they remain children. So they've been doing that. I mean, it's obviously a very high-level response here. And our Hillingdon Hospice Children's Bereavement Service have been working in quite some depth to understand and develop the response to childhood bereavement for children who are neurodiverse. And they've developed a practice approach that's won an award nationally. So there's been some really great stuff that's happened in the year. The priorities that we've agreed moving forward, so these again are our areas of focus, are around child sexual abuse. So that's child sexual abuse in all forms, around contextual safeguarding, education safeguarding, so we have a dedicated subgroup in respect of education, and also stronger families and early help. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Susie, thank you so much. That's a lot to take in, but I know there's lots of good work going on. I particularly am pleased to see that the Children and Young People have produced their own annual report, and also in the pack there was an easy read version, which was really helpful as well, so thank you for that. I'm going to start off the questions. First of all, I wanted to ask about the independent scrutiny and whether that's unique to Hillingdon, or do other local authorities do that too?
So that's a requirement. So that's something that's undertaken by every safeguarding partnership. What might be unique to Hillingdon is that our scrutineer considers our safeguarding adults arrangements in addition to children's.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And the other question I have is around safeguarding priorities. So this is on page 28 in the report. It says there have been some challenges in securing the engagement of education representatives. Can you just expand on that a bit, please?
So if we think about the education system and how we would effectively engage with education as a sector, it's very difficult for a head teacher from school A to be able to speak for schools B to Z. So for that reason, we have implemented the education safeguarding subgroup. So that's very much focused on how we fully engage with partners in education, and we have representation from early years, from primary, from secondary, from further education, and from special schools within that group. So we're hoping that will make sure that we have that really strong and clear education voice within the safeguarding arrangements.
Okay, thank you. Right, to questions. Okay, Mr. Little, I'll come to you first, thanks.
Thank you. If I may follow up on what the Chair was saying about the children's report, as I indicated before the meeting, I thought that was a great addition. And what you said about the children subsequently in your verbal report, and you talked about them wanting more in the way of life skills. And I'm sure schools won't welcome people giving them additional work, but can you indicate a little bit at the sort of areas where they were felt life skill training was inadequate currently?
No, so they came and presented to our safeguarding board in person, actually, which was lovely, and were asked a similar question. And one of the things that they were talking about is how to manage money, how to travel, really quite practical life skills that perhaps for children who have not experienced the same experiences, they may be getting through another form. So I think there's something for us as a partnership rather than specifically for schools about how we support these children to develop their life skills.
If I just to add to that, especially this applies especially to children who are looked after and they live in different sort of form of care, and they might live in various form of residential provisions, in various form of semi-independent provisions, foster carers, and their exposure to sometimes the inner going to the family when you're talking about paying a bill, when you're talking about going to a trip, when you're talking about going on holiday. Some of those things, they don't have that readily access to this. Sometimes what they're telling us is, well, some of those things, we need more exposure to those, because that is part of what we would normally sort of learn in a family, and sometimes we don't get the same degree of. So I don't think anyone said that anything is inadequate, but I think it was a difference of degree in terms of different children's experience and what you learn just by growing up in an environment you grow up into.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hager.
Thank you, Chair. A really good report. I did struggle in getting around it a bit, though, I have to say. I think it would have been a bit better if it was concise. And also, I sort of did lack, I felt, a little bit on outcome and numbers for me, because I can see we've done a really good job, but there's actually no crux, like that, okay, well, 200 people came through children's services and say 100, and that's more than we reached last year, and that's better than. So I think just a little evaluation would really help me to grab a little bit more of the report, because you clearly have done some amazing work here, but it's just I couldn't quite get the figures. On page 34, we've got about the children that are going through in last year 2 rapid reviews. I just wanted to know, we've got 2 rapid reviews, what was last year, what does it look like before? Is 2 a number that we would be happy with, or is there more? 2 doesn't seem like a lot to me, but obviously I don't know much about this. So could you just explain a little bit more around that, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll make a start, and then I'll hand over to Suzanne. Just to say, in terms of the report being quite substantial, it includes significant work that was done across the partnership, because this is obviously it's not just a local authority or just the police or just health. This is everyone together in children and adults, and also includes the findings of independent scrutiny as well. So this is probably, it's a lot of things to cover. So I think probably Susie and the team did a very good job of actually being quite concise to what it was a very eventful year. After COVID, after going back to where we are now, so all the other things that happened and all the challenges we had to address during the year. Regarding the data, I think it's valid point about various data, but I think the difficulty in a report like this is that this is not just about how many referrals we have, how many child protection plans we have. This is about everything that happened across the partnership, and we've heard about hospital, we've heard about police, we've heard about CNWL, ICB, all those partners. But the thing that we are doing throughout the year as part of the Child Safeguarding Board, we do monitor the performance of all the partners. So we have a data set that is reviewed at every board and is presented with information from all the safeguarding partners who are referring to things like stop and search in the police, for instance, admissions at the hospital, A&E. So all that is monitored throughout the year by the board and the chair of the board. So I think there's less of that in here as such because of the comprehensive nature of the report, but just to reassure you, that is being monitored through the ongoings of the board, and then obviously it gets reported up into the executive leadership group for that overall scrutiny. And regarding the rapid reviews, so I'll leave that part to you.
Yeah. So I think one of the strengths of our learning from practice approach is that we learn from where there is a statutory need to do so through a rapid review, but also perhaps where the criteria isn't met, so where we think or where it's assessed that we don't need to make a notification because the criteria to do so aren't met. However, we still think that there may be learning here. The numbers are quite difficult to say. That's a smaller number than we had made the year before, but it doesn't mean that we're not looking with the same level of scrutiny at what is happening within the borough. We make a referral or a notification to the national panel and undertake a rapid review when a child has suffered serious harm due to abuse or neglect. So that's a different threshold from significant harm. So we're talking about harm that has a lasting effect on a child. I'm pleased that we only needed to make 2 referrals. I feel that that's a good thing for Hillingdon, and I can offer you some assurance that where the criteria isn't met, we still do stop and think, actually, is there something more that we can learn here?
Okay, Councillor Sweeting.
Can I first say, phew. I mean, it is a very detailed report, and your enthusiasm, both of you, for the subject, well, it's not a subject, is it? It's a profession, etc., is excellent. There are far too many questions I've got here for this evening. So through you, Chair, I mean, some of them are very simple, but I've got a couple. One is relatively simple, and one is a bit more showing my ignorance, if I may. First of all, just finance, corporate finance, there's none at this stage. So all of this work and there's obviously, greater need. The more you look, the more need there is, really, I'm afraid. So is there an issue with funding of this service in its widest remit? That's the relatively easy one, and the other one will show my ignorance.
Thank you, Councillor. I will make a start on that point about the funding of the partnership. So the funding of the partnership is currently being provided by all the safeguarding partners to various contributions. So we do get an annual contribution from police, we do get an annual contribution from health colleagues, and obviously an annual contribution from the council as well. One thing of note is that currently the working together framework is being consulted and it's under review nationally. So we're going to have a new version of the working together coming out soon. And through the consultation event that we took part on, through the kind of the written response that was provided to the consultation throughout London and the country, there was a very clear question, a very clear demand to the DFE about including into the working together a funding strategy and a funding model and a kind of, or something to kind of direct all the partners towards what the contribution should be. Because at the moment, I think, our contribution meets our current demand, but the contribution models across the country vary. And I think it's excuse me, local authorities are probably in a better position in a sense, because one local authority equals one safeguarding partnership, because we are looking at Hillingdon as a Hillingdon local authority. But when we take into account, for instance, the Metropolitan Police and their BCUs, where they cover BCU, for instance, in our case, covered 3 boroughs. When we look at the ICBs, we cover, 7, 8, 9 boroughs. The reality of their funding is it needs to be split between all the areas they're covering. So they're struggling with that, understandably so. And this is why I think everyone who was part of the consultation, and the consultation wasn't just for local authorities, it was for all the partners, everyone sort of, in some of the meetings that I attended, were expressing some questions to the, in as part of the process about how that funding model is going to look and how that funding model can be made equitable for all the partners. So it's definitely the hot topic for many of us, and it is part of the national review.
The next one is showing my ignorance. Education safeguarding has become a national issue. You hear it. There are youngsters that have not turned up to school after COVID, and we're not talking about the home educated. We're talking about them in its and it also includes, terrible statistics, 3,000 that are permanently excluded. And although it's not mentioned specifically in your report because it would be so difficult, I suppose what I'm trying to say is what are we doing about making certain that we're capturing all of our youngsters and that none are slipping through any tiny, weeny bit of netting, because the numbers look to be quite horrendous nationwide, and of course we're part of the nation, and that's my concern. So I know that's an ignorant question, but it is a serious question for me to have answered. Thank you.
It's a good question. So the work around children missing education is led by the local authority, but there is obviously a partnership element to that. So when a child is missing from education, there are various checks that the local authority completes in conjunction with the school, and then there are also checks that are undertaken with other partner agencies. So, for example, we 18 months or so ago brought health on board for that, so checks were routinely made with colleagues in health. That has since been broadened to include border force, so looking to establish if children have perhaps left the country, which can happen. And currently looking at how we can support colleagues within education to make checks perhaps with police. Obviously it's a very complicated situation, and there's a lot to take into account. So that's how we try to minimise the risks that children who are missing from education face. And I think I mentioned the education inclusion toolkit as well. So there's some preventative work that's happening to try and reduce the risk of a child being excluded, or we don't say suspended anymore, do we? What's the word? A kind of a temporary exclusion or a permanent exclusion. So that suspension. Yeah, thank you. So if we're reducing the risk of a child being suspended or permanently excluded, then the likelihood of them being able to engage in education and continue engaging with education is increased. So we're trying to work at it from both angles.
And I would just add just another element to that, because I think it's probably we need to make a differentiation between children missing education and children who are missing. And I think children who are missing, it's one element of it, and we have various clear methodology of addressing that, working with police, working with various other, and the children missing strategy has been reviewed throughout the year, and we know that that's up to date. The children missing education, on the other hand, these are not necessarily children who are excluded, because children who are excluded, they don't necessarily missing education, they just receive education in a different way. And we conducted, and we're in the process of finalising a comprehensive review of our alternative provision in the borough to make sure that even children who are excluded from the mainstream schools, they still receive appropriate education through the alternative provision. And the key point of that, in the context of this question, is that what we're trying to look at is alternative provision not being an end destination, but being just another step into that child returning back into the mainstream school and achieving the education outcomes. So this is where we are to this, and I think credit to our colleagues from education, the child missing education numbers throughout the year have decreased substantially. And when you're going to be hearing various reports in this forum about the work that they've done and the different ways in which we try to track down where children missing education actually are, because some of them move with their families, some of them move out of the country, and so significant work was done by a whole team of people, and we reduced that number of children missing education significantly, because now we know where they are. Some of them are not missing education, they're just in another part of the country. Others are just being educated elsewhere or in different ways.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Batt.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for the report. I note that on page 53 that you say there were 14 suicides and 169 near suicides. I'm just wondering how many of these are young people, and what we are doing to support mental health issues, or even sort of, you mentioned child sex abuse. I guess because these are, of course, very difficult issues for people, especially young males, to confront, and how we are sort of disseminating information that can help and support them or their parents effectively, such as talk therapy, for example. I know we've got the youth offer, and how do you sort of measure the outreach if it's going successfully?
So, I think those numbers are referring to adults rather than to children. What we have within London now is something called the Thrive Suspected Suicide Surveillance System. That allows us to identify where it is believed that there has been a death related to suicide. There is proactive contact made by specialists with those who are bereaved. So that support is put in place very quickly through that. The other thing that we are able to do when we receive a notification, and it's led by Public Health, it doesn't sit within the Safeguarding Partnership, so led by colleagues in Public Health, there is a learning from suspected suicide panel that meets, that considers the circumstances of the deceased person, to identify any areas of learning, and then to act on those areas of learning. So that's the approach that's in place for adults. In respect of children and young people, I think we would need to be sensitive about using the word suicide for a child or young person, particularly pending the outcome of a coroner's investigation or coroner's court. So I think that's something to be aware of. Around awareness raising activity, so what we have done very recently actually, we promoted very widely World Suicide Prevention Day. That included sharing a number of resources, a number of training modules that are free to access, that are available online, to support people to have conversations about suicide. It can be a difficult thing for people to talk about. We're also working with colleagues in stronger communities who are leading work around International Men's Day, and the theme of that this year is working towards zero male suicide. So the gendered aspect of it is thought about, and we are also in conjunction with Rethink training across the partnership. I think we've got 60 places. Might need to check that number. So training professionals to deliver suicide awareness training, if that makes sense. So we're seeking to kind of provide sustainable training and awareness across the partnership, and doing that in conjunction, obviously, with our colleagues in CAMS and kind of mental health services. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Councillor Cawthorne.
Thank you. A couple of observations and a couple of questions, if I may. There'll be brief observations, I could assure. This is an area of service that I think, as members, we can never feel comfortable with by its very nature. It seems to me that we can recognise good practice, and certainly within the report there's a huge amount of that, and I'm impressed by the way we've reported. I'm impressed by the independent scrutiny, which is so important.
the stark reality that we all face in this role is that for all of that, we are only as good as the experience of the worst case, if you like, that an individual experiences, and we know sadly and tragically in some local authorities it just isn't good enough for all the good work that goes on. And I think as elected members, the very best we can do is do our darndest to apply a robust critical friend challenge to all our partners to make sure we're getting it right. And then we'll still worry about it because of its nature. So a couple of questions. First one really is going back to the child abuse, the grooming cases that were very well documented a few years ago. Because I can never quite forget that it wasn't known that it was happening. It was the way the professionals involved and some of the elected members involved chose to view and interpret it as young women making lifestyle choices. And it seems to me that there was much more concern about cultural sensitivity than child protection. Now, I'm not saying that's the case in Hillingdon, I very jolly hope it isn't, but can you perhaps just give me a few words on how those lessons have been applied in practice to what we're doing here to make sure that kind of wrong-headed, damaging thinking could never take hold here, because none of us would want that, I'm sure. That's probably enough for one question, I'm sure, and then I've got a brief one after that. Thank you.
So we very strongly, across the partnership, take a child-focused approach to safeguarding. So a child that is being, or maybe being exploited, whether that is criminally or sexually, is a child and a child first. And it is the onus is on the professionals to recognise that, and actually where needed, if that isn't the case, then there's a very clear message across the partnership to challenge, and we do that where required. And I think it's something that sometimes people can find frustrating, but we talk a lot about language. So we're talking about children, specifically children. We're not talking about youths or young males or females. We're talking about children, and that just keeps kind of reinforcing the message that these are children and children first, and children in need of protection or safeguarding. So that's the kind of approach that we take. Our Access, well, not ours, not the partnership, so the local authorities Access service routinely collates hard and soft intelligence around exploitation, so thinking about criminal exploitation, sexual exploitation, issues of serious youth violence, and undertakes like routine mapping exercises, so that if we think that there's evidence that an issue may be developing, it can be picked up that way. So we're training our professionals. We're actually educating our children and our young people as well. We know that our awareness-raising activity is reaching them, so they can speak up. We're training our professionals to be alert and to be child-focused. And then as a partnership, we're also monitoring to identify any early indicators. Is there anything you'd like to add, Alex?
Thank you. The other thing that I wanted to kind of just to reinforce that point is that I think we are very good at kind of listening at all levels, and we do have quite competent practitioners and professionals across the partnership, and we know that from the training we're providing, from the sessions we're running, from the awareness that we're doing, and in order to make sure that throughout the partnership, in case we have any difficulties in communication, agencies working with one another, we reviewed and re-implemented our escalation policy just to make sure that we have the right escalations in place. And to be fair, all the ones that we're seeing, which is, I think, is a positive, all the escalation gets resolved kind of stage 1 or stage 2, so they don't go all the way to, the chair of the board or to the ELG. And we do have, I think, like we have in here, we have quite a robust system of peer challenge, that sort of constructive challenge, and also that sort of critical friend sort of role that I think is quite important to have in scrutiny meetings on boards and forums like this, but also with one another in terms of how we work with individual children, individual families, and also at the strategic level. So I think that's fairly well embedded. And the other thing in terms of our learning that we mentioned quite a few times, the learning is not just about something that happened in Hillingdon. It's not just about those rapid reviews that we mentioned, or those sort of cases that kind of don't quite meet the criteria for rapid review. Our learning and our guidance we send out, it also looks at what happens at the national level, and those learnings from various different parts in the country where national reviews are being carried out, high-profile discussions, all that. We're not oblivious to that. Just because it doesn't happen now in Hillingdon, it doesn't mean that we don't need to learn from that and to make sure that we have the right information disseminated across the partnership. And I'll just stress, last point to stress on this one, we're not just talking here about one group of professionals or one agency. That's not just local authority or the police. When we send out a newsletter or we send out some practice guidance, that goes out to pretty much every single practitioner in the borough who works with children. And many of them actually do read them, because we know from talking to them that they've read the guidance. And for all of you, I would really encourage you to have a look at the Safeguarding Partnership website, and because all the resources that we're talking about, all the documents, all the briefings, everything we're talking about, it's all published there. It's all available, and it's all available to everyone. It's in the public domain, and so is things like this report, and so is things like the children's report. So all of this, we're very open with our partnership with everyone about this is what we're doing, this is what we're doing well, and this is where our sort of priorities and focus is.
It's helpful, thank you. Just one other question, if I may. And that's whether there are any recent quality assurance findings or recommendations that need or are receiving attention at all that you can share.
Sorry, could you?
Are there any recent quality assurance findings or beg your pardon, microphone on. Quality assurance findings or recommendations that either need or are receiving attention at the moment?
So, when we undertake an audit or a review, the learning that comes from that, the recommendations that come from that, are all monitored. Otherwise there would be limited value in undertaking the piece of quality assurance activity. So what happens is there is an action plan that's developed, and then each recommendation, irrespective of where within the partnership it sits, because some will refer to things like training, some might be about, the local authority needs to update this bit of policy or whatever it is, and then we go back and we check. So there are, of course, because it's ongoing, but there's nothing that I think needs more attention than it's being given, is what I will say. So things are monitored through our board and through the executive leadership group, and there are ongoing work strands.
Thank you.
Mr. Little.
Thank you. If you will indulge me for one very quick. First one, the idea of the young people for peer mentors, how are we taking that forward, or how can we take that forward? And the second one is the independent scrutiny. Who appoints the scrutineer?
So on the first question, that's one of the things that is ongoing. So we have an event with children and young people towards the end of October, so with some of the children that contributed to the report, where we're going to be essentially saying, you said, we did. And that's one of the things that is on my list of actually what is possible, because that's the other aspect of this, and our children understand that and recognise that. So it depends. To be frank, we haven't got a solid plan around that just yet. And in respect of the independent scrutineer, so the scrutineer is appointed by the executive leadership group. So that's made up of the local authority chief exec, Met Police Borough Commander, and the chief nurse from the Integrated Care Partnership.
Okay. Councillor Gill.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick, the report is amazing, very thorough, and it's very reassuring to know safeguarding policies and practices are upheld in the borough, because I think the best way to think of safeguarding is it could happen here, and having the procedures in place to tackle those issues. And on that, my question is, any weaknesses in our safeguarding practices or policies that exist or highlighted that we might be looking to improve on?
So there are some aspects of practice that I think we would refer to as being perennial challenges, and those are challenges not specific to Hillingdon. These are challenges across the national picture around safeguarding, and these are things that come up and have been, sadly, for decades. So those are things like information sharing and information seeking. They would include the need for professional curiosity all of the time, issues like respectful uncertainty. So actually, if what you're seeing and what you're hearing does not reflect what you're being told, we need to challenge that some more. One of our children described it as being you need to listen with your eyes as well as your ears, which we thought was quite insightful, really. So those issues continue to be a challenge for practice. Safeguarding is inherently complex and difficult work, and it's multifaceted. So what we do to mitigate that is we continue to revisit these areas of practice within the newsletters, within the practice briefings. We bring people back to it, and within our subgroups and the engagement that we do with, with our frontline professionals, operational managers and strategic leads.
Thank you.
Could I just add another point, just to say that some of the things that we know we need to, as a partnership, we need to work on, we need to focus on, like Sue described, those are quite often reflected in our priorities, and they reflect in the subgroups that we have. And the subgroups tend to be chaired by various people from partnership. It's not just one authority, one sort of agency that chairs those, and it tends to look at a wider range of both difficulties, issues, opportunities, learning in that particular area. So very likely all those difficult areas, those perennial issues, we're seeing those reflected through the work of our subgroups, and then reported obviously back to the board and back to the ALG, and then reflected into this and scrutinized independently.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for those. Just on page 48, it suggests that domestic violence cases are dropping in the borough. Just wondering, speaking to one of the group officers, they're suggesting that they're seeing a rise in domestic violence cases. Could you just clarify if it's increasing or decreasing? So page 48 on the bottom bit, not the top bit. Yeah.
That's in the adult social care section, yeah?
Yeah.
So that will be in reference to the categorisation of adult safeguarding inquiries. So not that domestic abuse as a whole is decreasing, but that the number of adult safeguarding inquiries undertaken due to domestic abuse is decreasing. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hager.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really excited actually to see a lot of the training programmes. You know me, I like the training. I think education and knowledge and protection is really important, so it is getting it out there. So I was really pleased to see the pilots that are going on with that as well. My question actually is on page 56. And I just wanted to know, at the bottom we've got our children and adolescent mental health services. I'm really pleased that we're having safeguarding champions. That's a great step forward. I wondered if you could tell me how many there are currently, and also regarding safeguarding as a whole, is there any particular areas in the borough that are, like we get more of an intake in, where they communicate more, and then certain areas that maybe we have to obviously to work with? Thank you, Chair.
So in short, Councillor, no, I can't tell you how many safeguarding champions there are within CAMS, but I can find out and I can get that across to you. In terms of areas of the borough, that probably lies more with.
Thank you. So the way in which we look at the data, the way in which we kind of cut and slice the data that we're reviewing, both in local authority and in the safeguarding partnership, and then to the partners, especially things like partners like police, for instance. We are looking at different areas of the borough. We map things like some of the maps that I think you mentioned before about school attendance and so on and so forth. So we do know where the demand is. We do know where our resources are, and we do know where we need to kind of focus more on some areas. And one good example of that intelligence being put to good use was the piece of work that Susie mentioned before when we talked about the launch of our contextual safeguarding strategy. The way in which we did that, we did look at the data. We did look at which part of the borough is kind of creating demand, or where we need to focus more of our resources as a partnership. And we did look at what's available in that particular area, and then what type of community we're talking about, who is the community, who are the residents in those areas, so we have a very clear understanding of the makeup of the area. What are the resources existing there? What are the things that we can employ and kind of build on in terms of what's available in the community, and also what we can and should do as a partnership to kind of focus more on that sort of preventative element, learning and building on existing localities. So the contextual safeguarding strategy, which looks at factors that are outside the home, so that sort of community factors and those sort of things that they are posing a risk to our children. Those areas, the purpose of the strategy is to enhance all those resources available in the locality, to bring them together, and with that to get a good understanding of that particular area and to have a coherent plan. What we're trying to achieve by what we're testing at the moment throughout this year is to have a strategy that we can almost lift and shift. So if it works in an area and we have the principle of how we engage the community, we have the principle of how we make a difference, if then that demand shifts and it becomes an issue in a different area, then we can apply roughly the same approach to have the same impact. So just to conclude that, I think the areas are changing. It's not always the same area, it's not always the same issues, it's not always the same type of demand. But I think the reassurance element is that we are keeping an eye on that, and through the performance monitoring that we have, we know where the demand is, and we are now in the process of testing a mechanism that will allow us to be flexible and to address those needs as they arise.
Councillor Kaur.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to understand if you've experienced any challenges in engaging with, say, schools or other stakeholders in this, and then if there were, what kind of challenges do you think, and how can we improve on that?
So we're talking about a really complex network of professional agencies, all with different priorities at different times. So it is inevitable that at times there will be priorities that perhaps don't quite marry up. Wherever we can, then we'll seek to kind of negotiate and work with the agency, and perhaps to identify ways in which we can support them to get the task done. Where that's not possible, then we would look to perhaps discuss that at a board level or via the executive leadership group. But by and large, most partners do respond and they do engage, and where they are not able to do so, they will provide a reason for that, and then we can work with that.
And you also mentioned on page 50 is the Child Sexual Abuse Hub. Have you identified a place for setting that up somewhere? Thank you, Chair.
Okay. So that work is being led by the Integrated Care Board rather than the Safeguarding Partnership, and it's kind of separate to the work that we're doing, if that makes sense. I don't believe they have identified a location for the hub, but I can find out for you and let you know. Okay, thank you.
Okay, any further questions or comments? No, great. Okay, I think we can bring this item to a close. Alex, Susie, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was really worthwhile, very comprehensive, but really good to hear and understand. So have a good evening. Thank you very much. Okay, agenda item 7 is our policy review discussion and guidance. Right, okay, so how are we all feeling about this? Okay, so I know we were thinking about different topics, and I did say that if you've got any suggestions, then you can email them across to Ryan. Ryan, has anyone emailed you? No. Okay, so has anyone, does anyone want to start? Mr. Little, I know that you were quite interested to kick this off. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Jan has already referred to it earlier, that's the question of absenteeism in relation to schools and the ensuing problems that come of that has occurred since COVID. There seems to be a much bigger problem than there was beforehand, and it seems to be very slow in returning. And I'm wondering whether we've got lessons to learn, practices to adopt that we're currently not pursuing in a way that we could. I thought it would make a good review topic.
Thank you. Councillor Cawthorne.
I don't want to say too much as a mere substitute of this, but I seem to recall that this sort of decision making was informed by a little bit of a report on the sort of corporate decision making cycle and what might add particular value at a particular time to make sure you pick something that's going to be useful and perhaps not unduly tie us up in a way that's not helpful. But I will merely throw that thought in. I mean, I'm not saying that's a bad idea that we've had from Mr. Little at all, but have we stopped doing that now? Here's my question, I suppose.
To my knowledge, no. I think that, so there was a conversation that Julie Kelly and myself had outside of the meeting, but this was about another topic, and we ended up speaking about policy review as a possible item. So her suggestion, actually, which I think is quite a good one, is that we've looked at early help and prevention quite a bit already. So maybe we look at the statutory pathways, something along the lines of the courts, thinking about the social worker and their work that's related to the court system, so we get a better understanding of kind of how they work with the legal system. I don't know, we need to flesh it out a bit more, but that was kind of some of the ideas that were generated there. So that could be a potential option. Councillor Hagger, you indicated.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Actually, just following on from that, I would like to do a little bit around the youth justice system, seeing if we've got any children at school that are in county lines, drugs, all that sort of thing, where they're going, how many. So I think it sort of ties in with everything that we've been speaking about at the moment. And I'd like to do something along those lines. I have no idea what happens to especially the secondary school children. What happens when they get into their gangs, what happens after that, they get pulled out, where are we with county lines, what's happening. It's a big thing, it's a big issue, it's becoming bigger. I just don't know what it is for us in the borough. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Sweeting.
Yeah, sorry, Chair, I missed that one. I mean, one of mine was about children not in education, including permanent exclusions. That's my tick list. But also I'm concerned about mental health. Now, I'm not certain whether any of the other select committees have attached that one.
Possibly the health and social care, is that right, Councillor Cawthorne?
Yes, I think we're about to firm up on recommendations around the council review, yeah.
Right. Also, a little bit of my bête noire, which is school standards and communication with our schools. I mean, both officers that produced the report on safeguarding, as well as we on our major review, it was a bit of a challenge to communicate with our schools. And as a governor of a school that's been Ofsteded today, by the way, there are issues sometimes with communication that the schools are seeing, and obviously the council is seeing the other side of that as well. And I don't know whether that's something that, if we don't do a major review on, we can consider as an issue of information that could come to us. The other one was, well, I think that's it. School standards, improving communication with schools and children not in education, including permanent exclusions. Those are a few of my thoughts.
Councillor Batt?
Thank you. One topic comes to mind is sort of the increase in cyberbullying for young people, and perhaps that could be linked with mental health, because I know that there's a huge rise in that, and there's a huge link between cyberbullying and mental health issues. So it could be a topic.
Yep, Councillor Gill.
I think just tagging along to Councillor Butt's suggestion, I think just the whole social media presence and the link of that with mental health. You see often in schools where just going on social media excessively causes mental health problems. So just looking into that on top of the bullying aspect of it as well.
Yes, Councillor Kaur.
Just as a mere sub for now, but I think what has piqued my attention is that, you know, a lot of SEND children, we are expecting our schools to take on more SEND children, like mainstream schools, just to see how it's impacting them, impact of, say, more SEND places on the mainstream school, if that's okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you for sharing those ideas. I think some of these might end up just being kind of information reports or updates rather than actual reviews, but obviously I'm not the expert here. I think we would need to take it away, speak to our officers in conjunction with Ryan and Democratic Services, just to make sure that everybody's kind of bored and happy, and we've actually got an actual review title, because right now we're just floating different ideas, which are all very good ideas, so thank you for your contributions. Okay, so we can move on to the next agenda item, which is our final review report agreement. So obviously this is based on the Stronger Families hub that we've been looking at. Any comments here on the recommendations? Councillor Sweeting?
Well, first of all, can I thank everybody concerned with producing this, because it reads really well. You know, the fact that we've got all of the minutes of the various meetings, I think that's a really good look. And I think the recommendations are pretty spot on. All I would say is I've been counting up, in my own little way, the number of times when the word capacity, lack of it, has been mentioned, and I think it's 18. So all I would suggest is that the recommendation 3, which is fine, is reviewing the capacity within the hub. So we could add, after increased demand, in the light of comments made by witnesses. So it would read, review the capacity within the hub to support increased demand in light of the comments made by witnesses. And then at the end, we could add, and also in respect of the hub's 24/7 remit, because that is different. You know, one of the witnesses said that has made, you know, I can't remember the actual word she used, but it was basically, it was stretched at night. The capacity at night was very stretched, because, you know, we're hearing issues coming to us, you know, 24/7 between the hours of, you know, 8 and 5 o'clock in the morning, etc. So that's the only suggestion I would make on the recommendation.
Okay.
Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Do you mind putting that in an email to Ryan and myself, just so we get the right wording that you're suggesting? Thank you. Mr. Little.
Just to echo what Councillor Sweeting was saying in both aspects. One, the quality of the report. I was very favourably impressed and thought it read well. And secondly, on this recommendation 3, the point I'd picked up was that they were stretched in the evenings, and that if anything went wrong, there was no backup. So, and it doesn't come across as clearly as it might in that recommendation, but otherwise I thought they were a good set of recommendations.
Any other questions or comments on this? Okay, great. So I believe that we delegate, is it the final version to the 3 of us? Yes, okay, great. Okay, so we move on now to agenda item 9, which is the forward plan. Any questions or comments on the forward plan? Councillor Sweeting, yep.
It's me again. Yes, there's a report going to the 12th of October meeting of Cabinet, which is changing of school admission arrangements. Now, we've got a meeting of our select committee on the 10th. Will we be having a sort of an audit of those schools where the admission arrangements will be changed, I wondered? Or do we just sort of look at what the Cabinet report is going to be saying on that? Because that links to, school capacity, etc. And there's a new item, I think it's a new item anyway, which is for the Cabinet meeting of the 9th of November, which DPS for Alternative Provision, Education and Send. I don't know whether we could have an update on that in our work programme, because that sounds a very interesting piece of work that's going on.
Yes, yeah, we can certainly put the second part, so DPS for Alternative Provision, on our work programme. Ryan, do you know anything more about Councillor Sweeting's first question, by any chance?
I think without wanting to get something wrong, I'd have to review and come back, because I believe we do have something coming on school.
I think we'll be able to see it anyway, because the Cabinet report will be out then, but it would be interesting to see.
Okay, any other questions or comments? No, great. Okay, so we move to our work programme, which is agenda item 10. Any questions, comments? Councillor Sweeting?
The leader of the council, when Cabinet discussed the 0 to 19 Families Hub, suggested a 1-year-on review. Now, I'm not certain whether that's a review from Cabinet, but it would have to come to us. But I think that would be a good look, to look at how it's all going. And I think the same really for the youth offer. And I really would be interested in getting our youth council here again, because I thought they were a breath of fresh air, and to have their views on the youth offer maybe at the same time after a year would be, a pretty good look, I think. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay, great. So we can bring this whole meeting, in fact, to a close. Thank you so much for your contributions this evening, and I wish you a safe journey home.